This is a brief introduction to normative ethics. Pretend you're in a large city, about 1 million inhabitants. There's a beautiful park in the city, and you're enjoying it. But you notice that there's a detonator for a very powerful bomb in the middle of the park. You know from your vast experience with such things that this detonator, if someone accidentally stepped on it, would cause an explosion that would destroy the entire city. You know what you have to do. You get everyone out of the park. You encourage them all to retreat to safety. But there's a problem. From your spot on the hill, which would be safe from the blast, you see that there's an infant crawling toward the detonator. This infant appears to be ready to press the button. Luckily, you have a bow and some arrows. You decide that your best option to save the city is to fire a shot near the button and try to distract the infant. You do that. Nothing happens. Nothing can distract the infant. You try again. Still nothing. You try again. Still nothing. The people who fled the park with you see your difficulty, and they leave. Now it seems like you have a choice. Your choice is do nothing, walk back over the hill to safety, or shoot the baby. What should you do? Maybe you're thinking that you should try to distract the infant some more, but time is running short and you're not a good enough shot. You try shouting at the child, nothing happens. What should you do? It's important to see that I'm not asking what you would actually do. That's a question we couldn't answer unless we were in a situation like this. I'm asking what you ought to do if you were in a situation like this. Maybe you think, as bad as it sounds, you should shoot the baby. Let's consider that claim. Is it an opinion? Maybe. But is it just an opinion? Maybe not. It could also be a fact. That is, it could be a true statement that's well supported by evidence. How would you support a statement like that with evidence? Well, if I asked you why you think you should shoot the baby, you might say, well, the baby will die either way. That's what you offer as evidence that you should shoot the baby. We'll call a presentation of evidence an argument. An argument has premises and a conclusion. The premises are the statements of evidence. This is your argument so far in standard form. By standard form, I just mean that the premises are above a line and the conclusion is below it. Now that we see this argument in standard form, it might not seem that appealing. Does the fact that the baby will die either way really provide evidence that you should shoot it? Is that generally true? That if somebody's going to die either way, you ought to shoot them? That doesn't seem right. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, that wasn't really my whole argument. I meant something more like, shooting the baby will save many more lives than not shooting the baby. And the baby will die either way, so you ought to shoot the baby. Now we've got an argument in standard form with two premises and a conclusion. Maybe you feel good about this argument. Maybe not. Maybe I'm on the wrong track altogether and you think that you should not shoot the baby. If I asked you why, you might say something like, you shouldn't shoot innocent people. So, you shouldn't shoot the baby. That's a different argument for a different conclusion. Notice for a second that the conclusion of this argument and the conclusion of the argument before, that you should shoot the baby, are inconsistent. They can't both be true. What that means is, something must be wrong with at least one of these arguments. So how should we figure out which argument has the flaw? A lot of what we'll be doing in this ethics course is trying to determine which ethical arguments have flaws and which ones don't. Before we can start on that project, we need a basic distinction, the distinction between descriptive claims and normative claims. Descriptive claims purport to say how things are, were, or will be, whereas normative claims make a judgment about how things ought to be or should have been. Descriptive claims could be true or they could be false. For example, I might say that the oldest living human is 135 years old. That's a descriptive claim. It happens to be a false one. Likewise, normative claims could be true or false. I might say, you ought to brush your teeth 17 times a day. That's probably false. But it's a normative claim because it makes an assessment about how things ought to be. Let's consider a few examples. You are sitting down. Descriptive or normative? Right, it's descriptive. Now, I don't know if it's true or false, but it's descriptive either way. You ought to be standing up. I don't know if that's true or false, but it's normative either way. Murder is wrong. Normative. Jan thinks murder is wrong. This one's tricky. Maybe you've noticed the normative word wrong in there. This one is a descriptive claim because it's telling you, or trying to tell you, what Jan thinks. If this sentence is true, then Jan is having a normative thought, but the statement itself is a descriptive one. What about our old claim, you should shoot the baby? Descriptive or normative? Right, it's normative. You ought to be standing up. Let's consider that again. Would it be possible to give evidence? Well, I might try this way. Standing up is better for your health than sitting, so you ought to be standing up. Maybe you're not convinced by this argument. You might believe that standing up is better for your health than sitting, but you wouldn't be convinced for that reason that you ought to be standing up. Maybe you're jogging. Well, I could try to rule that out with a premise. Here's my new argument. You are not jogging. Standing up is better for your health than sitting. Notice now that the premises of my argument are both descriptive. You aren't jogging. Standing up is better for your health. Well, those are both descriptive claims, while the conclusion is normative. Do these premises support the conclusion? Not really. Maybe you think to yourself, what I'm doing right now isn't really directed at a healthy outcome. You think, what I'm trying to do right now is understand this lecture. You're prioritizing understanding right now. Well, I could try to rule that out by adding a premise. You understand better when you're standing. Here's my new argument. It's got purely descriptive premises and a normative conclusion. Do the premises, if they're true, now I just made it up that you understand better when you're standing, but if those premises were true, would they support the conclusion? Would they require that the conclusion is true? Well, not really. Maybe what you're shooting for right now is comfort, not understanding. Maybe you're not concerned with health or understanding. You're concerned primarily with comfort. Well, I could try to rule that out by adding a premise. You're not concerned with comfort. Does this argument have good form? That is, do the premises relate well to the conclusion? Do they provide good evidence for the conclusion if they're true? Well, maybe not. Maybe the ceiling where you are is too low. You see that this could go on and on and on. We aren't ever going to get, by adding descriptive premises, an argument with good form. That is, we're not going to get an argument whose premises require its conclusion to be true unless we add a normative premise. Let's go back to the beginning and start over. Standing up is better for your health than sitting, so you ought to be standing up. What if instead of adding a bunch of descriptive premises, I add a normative premise like this? You ought to do what's better for your health than sitting. Now that argument has a nice relationship between premises and conclusion. If you ought to do what's better for your health and standing up is better for your health, then you ought to stand up. Now, I'm not trying to persuade you to stand up, but I am trying to convince you that if an argument has a normative conclusion, then in order for it to be a good argument, in order for it to have good form, it has to have at least one normative premise. There's a pithy way of capturing that truth. It goes like this. You can't derive an ought from an is. If an ought is a normative claim, and an is a descriptive claim, then you see that what this says is you can't get normative claims from only descriptive ones. That's going to be useful for us this term. Let's go back to our very first argument. Shooting the baby will save many more lives than not shooting the baby. Descriptive or normative? Well, that's just a description of the case. The baby will die either way? Again, that's just a descriptive claim about the case. What about the conclusion? So you should shoot the baby. No, that's plainly normative. This argument is missing a normative premise. What is the missing normative premise? Well, if shooting the baby will save more lives is supposed to connect to you should shoot the baby, don't we need a premise like this? You should do what will save many more lives. Now our argument has nice form. You should do what will save many more lives. That's a normative claim. Shooting the baby will save many more lives. That's still descriptive. Therefore, you should shoot the baby. Notice that we made the third premise obsolete. The first two do the work. What about the argument from the other side? This argument doesn't violate our rule. The premise and the conclusion are both normative. But the form of this argument isn't that great either. It seems to be missing something that connects the premise with the conclusion. We'd have to know that the baby is an innocent person. Now the argument has nice form. The baby's an innocent person. You should not shoot innocent people. Therefore, you should not shoot the baby. You see a problem with this requirement that you can't derive an ought from an is? If arguments with normative conclusions must have normative premises, then to support those premises, we would need other arguments with normative premises. But to support the premises of those arguments, we would need more arguments with normative premises, and so on forever. If I need normative claims in order to defend or justify normative claims, then I would need more normative claims to defend my premises. This is called a regress problem. Maybe you've been skeptical of our project so far. You think normative claims sound like opinions, and it sounds to you like it would be tough to justify those in an objective way. Maybe this is really the problem you were after. It's not really a huge problem. This regress problem shows up for any argument based on any kind of evidence, even descriptive claims. If I give you an argument for a descriptive conclusion, you could ask me to justify the premises, but then I might ask you why I should accept that justification, and so on forever. You can always keep asking for evidence. How do we solve this problem? Just like we do in arguments over descriptive issues, we can often stop the questions of justification in normative settings by finding common ground. In descriptive settings, we find common ground. You can keep demanding justification until I get to a justification that you'll accept. For example, if I'm trying to convince you that Chester Arthur was the 21st president, I might give you this argument. Chester Arthur was Garfield's vice president. Garfield was the 20th president, and he was assassinated. Maybe you say, how do I know Garfield was assassinated? And I say, well, Wikipedia says so. You might then ask me to prove that claim. Prove it that Wikipedia says so. If I can provide you evidence that Wikipedia says so, then we found common ground. How do we find common ground with normative claims? One way to do it is with easy cases. Here's an example. Consider the normative premise that we added to your argument above. You should do what will save many more lives. That was part of our justification for shooting the baby. I might try to convince you that you should not accept this normative principle or this normative claim by giving an easy case. Pretend there's a doctor who has 5 patients. Each of these patients needs an organ transplant. They all need different organs. One of them needs lungs, one needs a heart, and so on. These patients will all die very soon if they don't get a transplant. But the problem is, they all have the same extremely rare blood type, and transplant organs are not forthcoming. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on your perspective, a patient presents to the doctor. This patient believes he is in mortal danger. He believes he's dying. But the doctor knows at a glance that the patient just has the flu. Now, by reviewing the patient's medical history, the doctor sees that the patient has the rare blood type she needs. Here's the question. Should the doctor kill the presenting patient with the flu and distribute the organs to save the lives of the 5 patients who will die without it? Pretend the doctor could do this without getting caught. Should the doctor do it? Obviously not. That's an easy case that obviously contradicts the principle, you should do what will save many more lives. Just because that simple first effort argument fails, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't shoot the baby. That doesn't mean the other argument succeeds. The other argument might have a flaw of its own. It also doesn't mean that there isn't another argument for the same conclusion that doesn't fail. Now you see how the easy cases work in the establishment of general normative principles. If you're trying to figure out what the right general normative principles are, we'll say you're doing normative ethics. If you're applying general normative principles to particular cases, then we'll say what you're doing is applied ethics. So, for example, Our case at the start, when we're trying to figure out what we ought to do in that particular case, that's an example of applied ethics. When we were using easy cases to try and figure out if the first premise of the first argument was correct, we were trying to figure out what the right general principles were. So we were doing normative ethics. It's not a definition, but it's a general rule that normative ethics uses easy cases, and applied ethics solves hard cases. You might have been tempted when I gave the easy case to make it a harder case. You might have been tempted to modify the case so that the person presenting at the hospital with a rare blood type was a serial killer. Does the dilemma get a little harder then? Should you kill a serial killer to harvest his organs and save the lives of 5 innocent people? That's a tougher problem, and it's not as useful for the doing of normative ethics. We'd maybe call that a case of applied ethics.